Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Tibet Museum, I would like to welcome our speaker for today, Mr. Thubten Samdela. Mr. Thubten Samdela, he is currently the Director of Tibet Policy Institute, Central Tibetan Administration, and today he will be talking to you about Behind the Myth, Tibet's Buddhist Culture. So I would like to welcome Mr. Thubten Samdela.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Tibet Museum for inviting me to give this presentation, and thank you for attending it. I'll make my presentation very brief. I would like to draw your attention to the convergence between science and Buddhism, and to find out how much scientific fire there is behind the smoke of myths and rumors surrounding Tibet. So before that, we start with the various names by which Tibet is known. Tibetans themselves regard Tibet as the land of snows, and then another myth created by the Tibetans themselves is the myth of Shambhala. Tibetans consider Shambhala to be the perfect society, free of greed, sickness, aging. And based on Shambhala, James Hilton, in his book called Lost Horizon, created the image and the myth of Shangri-La, a place of eternal youth. And then Tibetans themselves believe that Guru Rinpoche, he was 8th, probably 9th century, this Indian saint, who was mainly responsible for implanting Buddhism very firmly in Tibet. So we believe that he was responsible for scattering in Tibet, in India, Bhutan, and Nepal, what we Tibetans call Heyu. When translated, it means the hidden valleys. So the hidden valleys are open, or the portals of hidden valleys are open to highly realized beings who could take sanctuary in the hidden valleys during times of civil strife and political turmoil. So, given our refugee status, we believe that Dharamsala is one hidden valley. And then these days, Tibet is referred to as the roof of the world, the third pole, and the water tower of Asia. This is because outside of the two poles, Arctic and Antarctica, Tibet has, the Tibet Plateau covers 2.5 million square kilometers. So it shoots up into the sky about almost 3 miles. So this whole landmass contains the biggest concentration of ice and glaciers outside the two poles. And these glaciers and ice feed Asia's 10 major river systems. And these river systems water much of Asia, much of China, Southeast Asia, India, including Bangladesh and Pakistan. So much the survival of millions of people in Asia depend on how well China managed Tibet's rivers. Now we come to the myths regarding Tibet. Outside world believe that Tibetans are capable of astral travel, levitation, Tibetan monks, lamas jumping from peak to peak, flying from peak to peak, clairvoyance, inner heat, And regarding inner heat, a scientist at Harvard University sometime back made an experiment on a Tibetan Lama who were practitioners in cultivating inner heat, and he was able to observe that this particular Lama was able to raise his inner bodily heat by many, many degrees. And then we Tibetans have the underlying belief of reincarnation. So these are the myths. So what is the real culture behind these myths? And there we come to the efforts made by the Tibetan scholars, Tibetan people, starting from the 7th century to the 11th century, whereby we imported the wisdom of Buddhism from India to Tibet. And in my very poor understanding of the transmission of knowledge from one culture to another, I believe that this is the greatest importation of knowledge from one place to another. And all this, here, where Tibetans sort of focus on this, or where the Tibetan kings sent bright young Tibetan students to study, was the place Nalanda. Nalanda is, I believe, one of the ancient world's premier institutions of higher learning. And besides Nalanda, the Tibetan scholars scattered across centuries also visited and studied at places in universities in Vikramasila, a place called Taxila in northwestern India then. But the main focus and concentration of Tibetan efforts to imbibe, study, understand Buddhism was at Nalanda University. And this university was desecrated in the 11th century, and many of the scholars from here fled to Tibet to seek protection and sanctuary. So one event which triggered Tibetan desire to imbibe cultures and knowledge from other realms was the territorial expansion of Tibet from the 7th to the 9th century. So with this expansion, the Tibetan people came in contact with the culture and civilization of China, cultures in Asia, and certainly with Buddhist knowledge in India and Nepal. And we at this stage certainly don't know why, of all the variety of cultures offered to them during the course of their expansion, the Tibetan kings decided that Buddhism was the body of knowledge or the way of life best suited to Tibet. And this phase of introducing Buddhism from India to Tibet took place in two stages. We call the first stage the early spread, and the second stage the later spread. The early spread of Buddhism from India to Tibet was state-sponsored, sponsored by the reigning Tibetan kings. And the latest spread during when the Tibetan Empire disintegrated autonomous areas within Tibet, they individually made efforts to continue to bring Buddhism from India to Tibet. So one pivotal figure in the early spread of Buddhism was King Songtsen Gampo. He lived in the 7th century. So what he did was he dispatched students to India, And one student called Thinisamputta was responsible for the invention of the Tibetan script. So with the invention of the Tibetan script, the Tibetans were able to disseminate Buddhist knowledge throughout the Tibetan plateau and beyond. And a later king called Tisu Desen, he invited two Indian scholars, Padmasambhava and Chandrarakshita. Chandrarakshita was the abbot of Nalanda University. So with the knowledge of these two highly realized beings, Tisun Desen requested them to build Tibet's first Buddhist temple, where monks were initiated, and the Samya temple in central Tibet was modeled on a place called Utantapuri. It somehow was modeled on the understanding of the scholars then of how the cosmos was shaped and functioned. So this is the early spread of Buddhism in Tibet, and then centuries later, we come to the later spread of Buddhism. So the later spread of Buddhism took place in the aftermath of the collapse of central Tibetan authority. Tibet broke into petty principalities, and one kingdom in Western Tibet, one king in Western Tibet initiated the effort to contact Indian scholars in central India. So at that time, one of his main concern was that there was a lot of, he wanted to purify Buddhism. So for this, he invited Adisha. Adisha was another very famous abbot at Nalanda University. He came to Tibet. He purified Buddhism, because at that time, along with this Buddhism, there were also a lot of other influences. So he separated the true teachings of Buddhism from later influences, which in a way served to contaminate the true teachings of the Buddha. So Adisha, he spent many years in Tibet, and he passed away in Tibet. So with the completion of the complete body of Buddhist wisdom, Tibetan Buddhism developed into, I'm very sorry, it's not very clear, into 4 schools of Buddhism called Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya and Gelug. And by the 11th century, the transmission of Buddhism from India to Tibet was complete. Tibetans did not have to depend on Indian scholars for commentaries or interpretation of Buddhist texts. And this whole body of knowledge was categorized into 2 main texts. One is the Kagyu, which is the teachings of the Buddha, and Tengku is the commentaries made by later scholars on the teachings of the Buddha. So this whole, the texts which Tibetans took from India for centuries was finally classified and catalogued. And one person who did this outstanding work was Budun Chogen Namgyal. And with this, so 2 events took place. The translation was complete, so the Tibetan scholars did not have to learn Sanskrit or Pali to go deep into Buddhist knowledge. And with the establishment of monasteries throughout Tibet, Tibet in turn became the center of learning for much of Inner Asia and for scholars and students scattered from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. So for many people in our part of the world, Tibet or the Tibetan monasteries in Tibet served as the Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, or Harvard of our modern world. And so, if you earlier on I mentioned that I would like to focus your attention on the convergence between science and Buddhism. So one very clear convergence is on our understanding of human psychology. And here I think Tibetan Buddhism or Buddhism has made huge contribution regarding our understanding of the functioning of the human mind and the ability of the human mind to perform not miracles, but the infinite capacity of the human mind to change. And a very clear example is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a guide for the dying to find higher rebirth. But it is, in essence, it's also exploration of how the mind works. And the Carl G. Jung, he is Sigmund Freud's rival in fame and scholarship. So he said that the Tibetan Book of the Dead served as his constant companion. And in reading and rereading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, he was able to find many insights which were not within Western knowledge. So you might ask, what's the whole point of the Tibetan effort to transmit Buddhism from India to Tibet? So the point I would like to emphasize is that an understanding of so Buddhism, in a way, many scholars say, is not a religion. It is a science of mind. So the essence of Buddhism is how we understand our human mind in order to make ourselves into more productive, more happier human beings. So this, I think, is the whole point of the efforts made by countless Tibetan scholars to bring Buddhism from Tibet to India. So I said I'll make it brief, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to continue the discussion. Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what was the religion before the Buddhism in Tibet, like what they were believing in.
It's called Bon.
Oh, yeah.
Bon is, in a way, a shamanist religion. It's a worship of nature. So in a way, this because Bon was sort of incorporated into Buddhism. So because of this, we Tibetans regard everything about nature sacred. So for Tibetans, high mountain passes, we believe these are the dwelling places of spirits. Lakes, rivers must be kept clean because they are the habitation of this local spirits. But scholars say Bon is a sort of an offshoot of a religion which tension between the two. But Bon was, in a way, many of the features of Bonism was incorporated into Buddhism, and this Guru Padmasambhava, he was born in a place called Urkin. These days, Urkin is in Pakistan, in a place called Swat. So he, I think, assumed the sort of the wrathful form of Buddhism. So many of the local Bonis deities or spirits in Tibet were tamed by him, and this is what we believe, and made to serve the Buddhist faith. Right, please.
What is the distinction between the four schools?
So we have Nyingma, the first school. The Nyingma, those who practice or those who follow Nyingma, they trace their spiritual lineage to Guru Rinpoche, the one who came from Pakistan, subdued all the local Tibetan deities. And then we have the Kagyu school, and the Sakya school and the Gelug school. So when the Tibetan scholars first started studying the teachings of the Buddha and translating them into Tibetan, all the scholars sort of adopted different Indian teachers. So, for example, with the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism, I think I don't remember the sort of the manifestation of Buddha which precise of the Kagyu school, but in India, the first human teacher to which they trace their lineage is Tilupa, and Tilupa taught Narupa, and Narupa taught Marpa. Marpa was the Tibetan translator who studied at the feet of Narupa. And then so each school of Tibetan Buddhism would have their lineage tree to say that my heritage, spiritual heritage, can be traced unbroken right to the Buddha through all these teachers. So Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism was founded, I believe, by the Sakya Pandita, and they became very politically very significant during the time of the Mongols. When when the Mongol hordes ran over all of the world, right from Korea to nearly Poland, they sort of created this universal empire, but there was no sort of spiritual glue to keep the empire together, and somehow they decided that when Buddhist masters might create a spiritual glue to keep the empire together. And I think one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan invited Sakya Pandita to come to Mongolia to spread Buddhism. So this tradition continued, and during the time of Kublai Khan, he invited Sakya Pandita's nephew called Chogyam Chogye Pakpa to Mongolia to give Buddhist teachings to the court of Kublai Khan. And at that time, this Buddhism remained a court religion within the Mongol Empire. But and the third Dalai Lama, probably in the 14th century, was invited by one, and at that time the Mongol Empire had broken up, but the Mongols, as this community, were very strong in Mongolia, in their Mongol homeland. So one of the Mongol chieftains invited the third Dalai Lama to Mongolia, and it was the third Dalai Lama who converted Tibetan Buddhism from a court religion into the Mongol people's religion. So the whole of Mongolia was converted. So in this way, the Mongols have the same devotion, respect, and belief in the Dalai Lama as we Tibetans do. And with the Gelug school is the fourth and the last major schools. So it was founded by Gesung Kapa. So he felt many of the practices in the rightly or wrongly in the first Tibetan schools had, in a way, not spiritually deviated, but somehow did not conform to the teachings of the Buddha, and Gesung Kapa reformed the school, and his teachings, he traces his teachings to this scholar, Atisha. Here, Atisha, the one who came from the Nalanda. So it's the emphasis with the Nyingma, Sakya, and Kagyu. Unlike them, Atisha's brand of Buddhism focuses on study, textual study, whereas the other three schools is more intuitive. They stress more emphasis on intuition, meditation. Here in the Gelug school is this solid academic accumulation of knowledge and how you practice what you have studied. So this is my brief understanding of the four schools of Buddhism. Please.
According to Buddhism, what is the nature of human mind and human psychology?
Well, you got me there. I would like to ask the same question. But my understanding is that through the Buddha has shown this path of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So his advice is that we human beings, by our very intelligence, are capable of taming our own mind. So how people do this is beyond me. But anyway, and he says he has provided the tools for human beings to tame his mind, to make ourselves more productive, and to increase our capacity for being happy human beings. This is all I know. My guess is as good as yours.
Because Advaita teaches that mind has no reality and it's all imagined, like thoughts are imagined. We just put our belief in thoughts and mind comes into being. But Buddhism, I guess, doesn't deny the existence of mind, and it says, okay, mind is there, but you have to tame it.
Well, this question I think you should put to someone better qualified than me. Please.
Can you explain the difference between like Hinduism, Advaita, the self, and Brahma versus Tibetan Buddhism? These two differences, Advaita and yes.
This really honestly I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. I've just I thought it's very important to explain the origins. I'm sort of by background, this historian. I'm not a psychologist. I have no insight more than you on what all this means. So I'm sort of giving a talk based on the sort of historical forces which compelled Tibetans to bring Buddhism from India to Tibet, and how how Buddhism shaped the fabric of this Tibetan society and our culture. But for these really these questions you ask, I think you would need to ask true scholars, Tibetan lamas, those who spent their lives studying the teachings of the Buddha.
The concepts of nirvana and these things, you mean?
Yes, everything. I've just told you how Buddhism came from, inadequately, I think, came from Tibet, from India to Tibet. The rest, I think, there are so many lamas, scholars, you might want to put your questions to that, please.
I hadn't heard of some of those myths that you listed.
Yes.
I was wondering, what are the sources for the myth of like astral travel and clairvoyance? Right. Where do those come from? Where do they originate?
These came from this early this Western travelers to this Tibet. When the British took over India, so British had this very near access to Tibet, and with the British Raj came all the explorers, diplomats, writers, journalists, and those who were fascinated by the myths surrounding Tibet. So many of the sort of people, for example, this Alexander David Neame, she was a major contributor or myth maker of Tibet. I mean, she's written so many books, and she sort of in her writings talked about this astral travel, skywalkers, monks able to fly from one place to another. So these are myths created by people from the West.
But there's no scientific backing for that at all.
I mean, as far as I understand science, and as far as I understand Buddhism, there is no link. But what I try to put forward to you is that in terms of our understanding of human psychology, there's, I think, science has a lot to learn from Tibetan Buddhism. So this is where they converge, how we understand. I mean, the Dalai Lama very often says jokingly that compared to Buddhist the psychology, modern Western psychology is at the kindergarten stage. So, so this is where they converge. So in terms of examination of material things, I think that's where Buddhism lags far, far behind modern science. Right then, thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
I would like to thank everyone for coming here.